During the first week of December, the Russians made determined attacks to split the Sixth Army. In heavy defensive fighting, its panzer divisions lost almost half of their remaining 140 tanks. They were badly handicapped by the shortage of fuel and ammunition. On 6 December, a battle group from the 16th Panzer Division was sent into a counterattack on foot because they had no fuel for their half-tracks. Lieutenant von Mutius, the young officer who had been so proud to be the last member of the Wehrmacht to withdraw across the Don, was the second in command. Their objective was a hill north of Baberken, which they managed to seize, but suddenly Russian tanks appeared out of a balka, supported by infantry. The battle group commander gave the order to pull back. A systematic withdrawal was impossible, reported a sergeant major later. Each man ran for his life. The enemy fired after us with all their weapons. Half of the battle group was wiped out. Lieutenant von Mutius was badly wounded. In order to prevent worse casualties, he kept shouting, "Spread out!" The sergeant major was convinced he had saved many lives as he lay there helplessly waiting for the Russians. The survivors thought him a real hero. After numerous attacks, Soviet commanders realized that the besieged were far from beaten. The 57th Army of the crucial southwestern sector had suffered heavy casualties. Explanations for Soviet failure were interesting. One report, artillery and infantry did not interact very well when storming the enemy defense line, sounds like a circumlocution for heavy casualties from friendly fire. Soldiers are not well enough instructed on the need to dig trenches was another unhelpful observation. Their failure to do so led to irreparable losses from German tanks and aeroplanes. No mention was made of the fact that the ground was frozen hard and that entrenching tools were in very short supply. Behind the lines, NKVD officers and interpreters worked late into the night interrogating German prisoners, including the first deserters, as well as tongues captured by reconnaissance companies. The Bolsheviks often seized prisoners from us, reported a lieutenant from the Austrian 44th Hoch- und Deutschmeister Infantry Division. Don Front intelligence was trying to identify demoralized divisions on which attacks should be concentrated. It soon observed that the 44th and the 366th Infantry Division, soldiers, having demolished the houses of civilians, revealed an instinctive desire to turn their own dugout into a new home. The revetted communications trenches and the earthworks round the entrances to bunkers gave no impression of what one might find within. They fashioned frames for picture postcards or cherished snapshots. Some things were always respected. No man would touch or insult the photograph of a comrade's wife or children. Officers made sure that they had bunks, benches, and a table. General Edler von Daniels, the commander of 376th Infantry Division, had a bunker complex designed by one of his staff with impeccable architectural plans after they moved to their new position on the southwest flank. The commanding officer of Dr. Kurt Reuber, the priest serving as a doctor with 16th Panzer Division, had a particularly large bunker dug so that he could fit a piano inside, which had been abandoned by another division. And there, underground, unheard above and muffled by the earth walls, he played Bach, Handel, Mozart, and Beethoven's pathetic sonata. His interpretation was beautiful, but also, it seems, obsessive. The commanding officer played on even when the walls trembled from bombardments and soil trickled down. He even continued to play when officers came in to report on the fighting outside. Some units were fortunate enough to retain their old positions. The 297th Infantry Division, south of Stalingrad, had finished its elaborate underground sanatorium before the Russian offensive. They feared that they might lose it together with all the hospital equipment, beds, crockery, and cutlery brought by train from Germany. But when the front line of the Kessel was established, their precious hospital, to their relief, was still just a few miles behind the new front line. Many soldiers had still not received proper winter clothing before the encirclement, so they resorted to improvisation with varying degrees of success. Under their uniforms, more and more of them wore articles of Soviet uniform, buttonless tunic shirts and baggy quilted trousers, and the highly prized quilted jackets. In hard frosts, a steel helmet underneath the lantern. In a little house. I sit every evening, searching for a louse. During the long nights of the Russian winter, there was ample opportunity for conversations about home and how much better life had been before coming to Russia. In the 376th Infantry Division, they bemoaned their departure from Angoulême for the Ostfront, leaving behind cafes, cheap wine, and French girls. Other thoughts went further back, to the triumphant welcome home in the summer of 1940. The waving crowds, the kisses, and the adulation had been largely inspired by the idea that the fighting was as good as over. The vast majority of the country had cheered Hitler for having brought them through a short, victorious war with so few casualties. Often, when thoughts turned to home, harmonicas played sentimental tunes in the bunker. After such a dramatic reversal of fortune, men grasped at rumors more than ever before, with constant questions and ill-informed speculation. Even their officers had little idea of the true situation. Another subject linked to the chances of getting out was the perfect wound which would not cripple or be too painful, yet would still qualify its recipient for evacuation by air. Comrades who had gone on leave just before the encirclement were viewed with admiring envy, while those who had returned just before faced good-natured but no doubt deeply provoking jokes. One person who never complained of his bad luck was Kurt Ruber. He had returned to his unit just 2 days before the Kessel was closed. It would soon be hard to tell whose services would be more needed, those of the doctor or those of the priest. Besieged Germans imagined that the Red Army soldiers opposite them lacked for little in either rations or warm clothing, but this image was often inaccurate. Zhukov was characteristically to the point when he described the encirclement of the Sixth Army as a tremendous education for victory for our troops. Grossman was also right when he wrote, "The morale of the soldiers has never been so high." Interestingly, neither of these observations exactly confirmed the official Soviet propaganda line that the morale of an army depends on the socially just and progressive order of the society it defends. Red Army soldiers now took a predictable pleasure in taunting the enemy who had so recently taunted them. Some companies sent out a patrol at night with a scarecrow dressed up as Hitler. Then they erected it in no man's land and hung a placard inviting Lancers to shoot at it. The scarecrow would be booby-trapped with a couple of grenades in case a German officer sent out a patrol to remove it the next night. On a more organized basis, NKVD propaganda companies set up their loudspeakers. For hours on end, the loudspeakers blasted out tango music, which was judged to convey a suitably sinister mood, interspersed by messages prepared on gramophone records to remind the beleaguered troops of their hopeless position. At first, these activities had little influence, but later, when German hopes began to fade, the effect became cumulative. The Red Army, realizing that the Germans had to economize on artillery shells because they were so heavy to fly in, went in for probing attacks, trying to provoke a reply. The most overworked troops at this time were the divisional reconnaissance companies that acted as pathfinders for these raids. "We were like gypsies, here today, gone tomorrow," remembered an officer who was one of 5 survivors from the original company of 114 men. Patrols, usually of 5 or 6 men, would penetrate the Kessel and hide up near roads in white snowsuits to observe traffic and troop movements. On their return, they would seize a tongue for interrogation. Patrolling activity was particularly intense on the southwestern flanks of the Kessel. Soviet commanders were certain that the Germans would make an attempt to break out, and they wanted to be forewarned. The flat, snow-covered steppe was dangerous for reconnaissance patrols, with the machine gun posts enjoying good fields of fire. On one occasion, early in December, however, a reconnaissance party, backed by a raiding group, slipped up to the trenches opposite, only to find them empty. The Germans had pulled back to warmer bunkers behind. After the first Russian infantrymen had explored the trenches and fire bunkers undisturbed, the commander of the reconnaissance party inspected the booty, including a long sheepskin coat. Then, next to the field telephone, At this stage of the war, the risk of being denounced at the front was really quite small. As one veteran put it, a soldier felt that having paid with his blood, he had the right to free speech. He had to be far more careful if evacuated to a field hospital, where informants and political officers were vigilant for any criticism of the regime. Danger returned at the front towards the end of the war during the advance into Germany. The Army's task was almost over, and the NKVD special departments, by then SMERSH, wasted no time in reimposing the Stalinist terror. Soldiers tantalized themselves with talk of food at home as well as daydreaming. Some platoons were fortunate enough to have a gifted storyteller inventing modern fairy tales. They played cards, although it was officially forbidden, and chess. Now that they were in fixed positions for a little time, it was worth carving proper pieces and fashioning a board. Most of all, they reminisced. Muscovites talked constantly of their home city, not so much to impress comrades from the provinces, but out of a genuine homesickness in the emptiness of the steppe. Writing home was very difficult, confessed the lieutenant of Marine Infantry. It was impossible to tell the truth. Soldiers at the front never sent bad news home. His parents kept all his letters, and when he reread them after the fire flickers in the narrow stove. Resin oozes from the log like a tear, and the concertina in the bunker sings to me of your smile and eyes. The bushes whispered to me about you in a snow-white field near Moscow. I want you above all to hear how sad my living voice is. You are now very far away. Expanses of snow lie between us. It is so hard to come to you, and here there are 4 steps to death. Sing concertina in defiance of the snowstorm. Call out to that happiness that has lost its way. I'm warm in the cold bunker because of your inextinguishable love. Within the Kessel, 6th Army discipline was maintained rigidly. Hitler, meanwhile, in a typical attempt to secure loyalty, started to become generous with promotions and medals. Paulus was raised to Colonel General. For soldiers, the main source of consolation was the Führer's promise that he would do everything. Snow began to fall heavily at the end of the first week of December. Drifts filled Balkas, forcing those who lived in caves excavated from their sides to dig their way out. There was little fuel for any vehicles, and the horses pulling ration carts were so starved that their strength had to be spared on the smallest hills. Chaplain Altman of the 113th Infantry Division, after hitching a ride on one, recorded, "I can't remain seated because the horse is so ill-nourished that he cannot stand the slightest strain." Altman was above all struck by the pathetic youth of soldiers in the regiment he was visiting. Their first question was utterly predictable: when are we going to get more to eat? He also noted that although it was only the 2nd week of December, already their wretched bunkers in the middle of this treeless steppe have Christmas decorations. At battalion headquarters, he received a telephone call warning him of an un-Christmas-like duty. Tomorrow morning at dawn, execution of a German soldier, 19-year-old, self-inflicted wound. Although all soldiers suffered badly from hunger, most still had no idea of the size of the supply problem facing the 6th Army. Hitler, when ordering Paulus to stay in place, had promised that more than 100 Junkers 52 transport aircraft would be delivering supplies. Yet during the air bridge's first week of operations from 23 November, the airlift did not even average 30 flights a day. 22 transport planes were lost due to enemy action and crashes on 24 November, and another 9 were shot down the following day. Heinkel 11Hs had to be taken off bombing missions in a desperate attempt to make up the losses. Richthofen rang Jashonik 3 times in an attempt to convince him that they lacked the aircraft to supply the Sixth Army by air. Göring could not be contacted. He had left for Paris. The airlift did not provide anything like the bare minimum of 300 tons a day promised. Just 350 tons arrived during the course of the whole week. Out of this 350 tons, there were only 14 tons of food for a ration strength by then reduced to 275,000. 3/4 of the total load consisted of fuel, of which part was for the Luftwaffe's own aircraft based at Potomnik to protect the transport aircraft from Russian fighters. Stalin began to suffer from a characteristic bout of impatience. He wanted everything to happen at once, both Operation Saturn and the rapid destruction of the Sixth Army. He had already given orders for the Second Guards Army, the most powerful force in the Red Army, to deploy west of Stalingrad, ready for the attack on Rostov. But as Vasilevsky discovered in the first week of December, even with 7 Soviet armies deployed against them, Paulus's divisions were going to be much more difficult to destroy than they had imagined. On 28 November, Stalin asked Zhukov for an assessment of enemy intentions. Zhukov sent his report the next day. The trapped German forces are not likely to try to break out without help. Manstein's plan to rescue the Sixth Army, Operation Winter Storm, was developed in full consultation with Führer headquarters. It aimed to break through to the Sixth Army and establish a corridor to keep it supplied and reinforced so that, according to Hitler's order, it could maintain its cornerstone position on the Volga with regard to operations in 1943. Manstein, however, who knew that Sixth Army could not survive the winter there, instructed his headquarters to draw up a further plan in the event of Hitler's seeing sense. This would include the subsequent breakout of Sixth Army in the event of a successful first phase, and its physical reincorporation in Army Group Don. This second plan was given the name Operation Thunderclap. Winter Storm, as Zhukov had predicted, was originally planned as a 2-pronged attack. One thrust would come from the area of Kotelnikova, well to the south and around 100 miles from the Sixth Army. The other would start from the Cheer front west of the Don, which was little more than 40 miles from the edge of the Kessel. But the continuing attacks of Romanenko's 5th Tank Army against the German detachments along the River Cheer ruled out that start line. This left only the 57th Panzer Corps round Kotelnikova, supported by the rest of Hoth's very mixed 4th Panzer Army, to relieve Paulus's trapped divisions. The 57th Panzer Corps, commanded by General Friedrich Kirchner, had been weak at first. It consisted of 2 Romanian cavalry divisions and the 23rd Panzer Division, which mustered no more than 30 serviceable tanks. The 6th Panzer Division, arriving from France, was a vastly more powerful formation, but its members hardly received an encouraging impression. The Austrian divisional commander, General Erhard Raus, was summoned to Manstein's royal carriage in Kharkov station on 24 November, where the field marshal briefed him. He described the situation in very somber terms, recorded Raus. 3 days later, when the first trainload of Raus's division steamed into Kotelnikova station, on 12 December, after a brief artillery bombardment, Hoth's panzers struck north. The German soldiers inside the Kessel listened eagerly to the distant sound of fighting. Confidence seemed boundless. Excited rumors ran around the Sixth Army. "Manstein is coming," soldiers said to each other, almost like the Easter greeting of the Orthodox Church. For Hitler loyalists, the distant guns were proof once more that the Führer always kept his word. Hitler, however, had not the slightest intention of allowing the Sixth Army to break out. In his midday conference at the Wolfschanze, he told Zeitzler that it was impossible to retreat from Stalingrad because this would involve sacrificing the whole meaning of the campaign, and argued that too much blood had been shed. As Klug had warned Manstein, he was still obsessed with the events of the previous winter and his order to Army Group Center to hold fast. Once a unit has started to flee, he lectured the Army Chief of Staff, the bonds of law and order quickly disappear in the course of flight. The Soviet commanders did not expect Manstein's offensive quite so soon. Yeremenko immediately feared for the 57th Army, which held the southwest corner of the Kessel. Vasilevsky was at 51st Army headquarters with Khrushchev on 12 December when the news of the German attack was received in a radio signal. He tried to ring Stalin in Moscow, but could not get through. Not wanting to waste a moment, he contacted General Rakovsky, the commander of the Don Front, and told him that he wanted to transfer the General Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Guards Army to the command of the Stalingrad Front to block Manstein's offensive. Rakovsky protested strongly, and to Vasilevsky's dismay when he finally got through to the Kremlin on the telephone that evening, Stalin was angry at what he thought was an attempt to force him into a decision. He refused to give an answer and forced Vasilevsky to spend a very anxious night. In the meantime, Yeremenko had ordered the 4th Mechanized Corps and the 13th Tank Corps to block the headlong advance of the German armor. Field Marshal von Manstein sent Major Eismann, his intelligence officer, into the Kessel on 19 December. His mission, Manstein claimed later, was to brief Paulus and Schmidt to prepare the Sixth Army for Operation Thunderclap. Different versions and different interpretations of what was said at this meeting will never be resolved. It is, however, clear that Manstein still avoided taking the responsibility for disobeying Hitler. He would not give Paulus a clear lead and refused, no doubt for sound reasons of security, to fly into the Kessel to discuss the matter with him face to face. Yet Manstein must have known from the start that Paulus, a firm believer in the chain of command, would never have broken out without a formal order from higher command. Manstein's efforts in his memoirs to absolve himself from any blame for the fate of Sixth Army are curiously exaggerated, as well as unfair on Paulus. It would appear that he suffered from an uneasy conscience, and yet nobody blamed him. On 16 December, just 4 days into Hoth's offensive, the 1st and 3rd Guards armies, as well as the Soviet 6th Army further up the Don, attacked south. Slowed by thick, freezing mist, with their tank formations blundering into minefields, the Soviet operation did not get off to a good start. Within 2 days, however, the Italian 8th Army had crumbled after some acts of fierce resistance. There was no reserve ready to counterattack, now that the 17th Panzer Division had joined Hoth's operation east of the Don, so the Soviet tank columns broke out southwards into open, snow-covered steppe. The grave freeze in the region, which began on 16 December, did little to slow the brigades of T-34s rampaging in Army Group Don's rear. Railway junctions and stations were captured just as wagons full of equipment had been set ablaze by German support troops before they fled. The gravest threat to the Germans was the 150-mile advance of Major General Vasily Mikhailovich Bogdanov's 24th Tank Corps. On the afternoon of 23 December, it overran Skasirskaya, just to the north of Tatsinskaya, the main Junkers 52 base for Stalingrad. General Fiebig had received an order from Führer headquarters that his aircraft were not to abandon the airfield until it came under artillery fire. Bogdanov, after this bold raid, found himself cut off for 5 days, badly mauled and out of ammunition. Stalin was unstinting in his appreciation. The formation was retitled the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, and Bogdanov was the first to receive the new Order of Suvorov. Red Army propaganda claimed that his tanks had destroyed 431 aircraft in all, but this was a typically wild exaggeration. The important result, however, was that Tatsinskaya was never used for transport missions again. The Luftwaffe had to move even further out to a completely makeshift airfield. The outcome of Hoth's rescue mission had already been decided. The threat to the left flank of Army Group Don and the possibility of a breakthrough towards Rostov, apparently confirmed by the interrogation of the Chief of Staff of the 3rd Guards Army, who was captured on 20 December, forced Manstein to reconsider his whole position. The panzer divisions on the Mishkova were also receiving a heavy battering, with 6th Panzer Division losing 1,100 men in a single day. On the evening of 23 December, Hoth's Panzer Corps received the order to pull back without any explanation. Right down to the most junior soldier, it was absolutely clear, wrote General Raus, that this signified defeat at Stalingrad. Although nobody yet knew the reasons behind the order, officers and men had a strong inkling that something ugly must have happened. That same night, Paulus and Manstein discussed the position in a conference conducted via teleprinter. Manstein warned that the 4th Panzer Army had met heavy resistance and that the Italian troops on the northern flank had collapsed. Paulus asked whether he had finally received permission for the 6th Army to break out. Manstein replied that he still had not obtained agreement from Supreme Headquarters. He was sparing with the details. If Paulus had been given sufficient... On 19 December, General Chuikov crossed to the east bank of the Volga for the first time since changing his headquarters in October. He crossed the ice on foot, and when he reached the far side, he apparently turned to gaze at the ruins which his army had held. Chuikov had come over for a party given by the commander of the NKVD troops, Major General Rogatin, in honor of the 24th anniversary of the founding of the Special Department of the Cheka. Chuikov, on his return, when very drunk, fell through a hole in the ice and had to be fished out of the freezing water. The commander of the 62nd Army nearly met an ignominious and anticlimactic end. While the Russians welcomed the low temperatures, the doctors in Paulus's army dreaded them for several reasons. The resilience of their patients, both the sick and the wounded, declined. Frost in an open wound could rapidly prove lethal. The hardness of the ground when shells, Katyusha rockets, and mortar bombs exploded seemed to be the only explanation for the great increase in stomach wounds with which they were faced. And from the middle of December, there was a steadily increasing number of serious frostbite cases. The feet were not just swollen and purple, a degree treated with ointment, a bandage, and returned to duty, but black and potentially gangrenous, often requiring rapid amputation. As early as the 2nd week of December, doctors had started to notice a more disturbing phenomenon. An increasing number of soldiers died suddenly without having received a wound or suffering from a diagnosable sickness. Rations indeed were severely reduced, but for doctors, it still appeared to be far too early for cases of death by starvation. The suspected causes, wrote the pathologist entrusted with the inquiry, included exposure, exhaustion. None of the approximately 600 doctors in the Kessel ventured to mention starvation, and above all, a hitherto unidentified disease. On 15 December, Dr. Girgensson, the 6th Army pathologist, then working in the hospital next to Tatsinskaya airfield, received the order to fly into the Kessel next day. Unfortunately, we don't have... The cold was so bad that it was both difficult and painful for Girgensson to pull on his rubber gloves. Each evening he typed up the results by candlelight. In spite of such difficulties, which included Soviet air attacks and artillery bombardments, Girgensson managed to perform 50 autopsies by the end of the month. In exactly half of this sample, he found clear signs of death by starvation. atrophy of the heart and liver, a complete absence of fatty tissue, a severe shrinkage of muscle. In an attempt to compensate for the low-calorie diet of bread and Wassersuppe with a few tiny bits of horse meat, Army Group Don flew in small tins of meat paste with a high fat content, but this proved counterproductive. Quite often, when a sergeant was making his rounds of the sentry positions and a soldier said, "I'm fine, I'll now have something to eat," and then consumed some of the high-fat meat paste, the man was dead by the time the sergeant made his next round. Death from starvation, Gergensen observed, was undramatisch. The highest proportion of cases of death by starvation occurred in the 113th Infantry Division. Here, at least, Gergensen discovered a clear explanation. The quartermaster of the division had cut rations before the encirclement to hoard them as a precaution against insufficient supplies during the autumn rains. As a result, the men were already undernourished by the second half of November. Then, after several divisions had lost all their supplies during the retreat, severe malnutrition also reduced a patient's ability to survive infectious diseases such as hepatitis and dysentery in the earlier period of the encirclement, and more serious diseases right at the end, particularly typhoid and typhus. Out in the steppe, there was no water for washing bodies, let alone clothes, simply because there was not enough fuel to melt snow and ice. "There's little new here," wrote a Panzer Grenadier lieutenant in the 29th Motorized Infantry Division. "Top of the list is the fact that every day we become more infested with lice. Lice are like the Russians. You kill one, 10 new ones appear in its place." Lice would be the carriers for the epidemics which decimated the survivors of Stalingrad. The immediate concerns of medical staff, however, still focused on weakness from lack of food. "Slowly, our brave fighters are starting to become decrepit," wrote an assistant doctor. He went on to describe an amputation at the thigh he performed by torchlight in a dugout without any form of anesthetic. "One is apathetic towards everything and can only think about food." The need of German soldiers for hope was mixed with a hatred for the Bolshevik enemy and a longing for revenge. In a state of what was called Kessel fever, they dreamed of an SS Panzer Corps smashing through the encircling Russian armies to rescue them, thus turning the tables in a great, unexpected victory. They tended to be the ones who still listened to Goebbels' speeches. Many kept up their spirits by singing the Sixth Army song, Das Voldelied, to the tune of Franz Lehar. "There stands a soldier on the Volga shore, keeping watch there for his fatherland." The Operational Propaganda Detachment at Don Front Headquarters, using its German communist assistance, decided to exploit the Lancers' fondness for songs. They broadcast from their loudspeaker vans an old favorite, which, in present circumstances, had a cruel twist. In the homeland, there awaits a warm reunion." The German communists under NKVD supervision consisted of Walter Ulbricht, the poet Erich Weinert, the writer Willy Bredel, and a handful of German prisoners, 4 officers and a soldier, who had been recruited to the anti-Nazi cause. They taught criers, who were Red Army men, chosen to crawl forward to dead ground in front of German lines and shout slogans and items of news through megaphones. Few of them knew any German, and most were killed. The main activity of the propaganda, the first encirclement of a large German army trapped far from home, ordered to stay put and finally abandoned to its fate, has naturally created an intense debate over the years. Many German participants and historians have blamed Paulus for not having disobeyed orders and broken out. Yet, if anybody was in a position to give Paulus, who was deprived of vital information, a lead in the matter, it should have been his immediate superior, Field Marshal von Manstein. "Can one serve 2 masters?" Strecker noted when Hitler rejected Operation Thunderclap, the breakout plan to follow Operation Winter Storm. But the German army only had a single master. The servile record since 1933 of most senior officers had left it both dishonored and politically impotent. In fact, the disaster and humiliation of Stalingrad were the price which the army had to pay for its hubristic years of privilege and prestige under the National Socialist umbrella. There was no choice of master short of joining the group round Henning von Treschow and Stauffenberg. Much time has been spent debating whether a breakout was feasible in the second half of December, yet even panzer commanders acknowledged that the chances of a successful breakout diminished with each week. The infantry had even fewer illusions. "We survivors," a corporal wrote home, "can hardly keep going owing to hunger and weakness." Dr. Alois Beck quite rightly disputed the legend that a breakout would have succeeded. The Russians would have shot the half-frozen soldiers down like hares because the men in their weakened state could not have waded through over a foot of snow with its crust of ice on the surface, carrying weapons and ammunition. "Every step was exhausting," observed a staff officer from 6th Army headquarters. "It would have been like the Berezina." The whole breakout or defense debate is thus a purely academic. The argument about breaking out of the Kessel in the second half of December overlooked one curiously important psychological factor. Christmas was coming. No formation in the Wehrmacht was more preoccupied with the subject than the beleaguered 6th Army. The quite extraordinary efforts devoted to its observance in bunkers below the steppe hardly indicated an impatience to break out. Lethargy from malnutrition combined with escapist daydreaming no doubt played a part, and probably so did the fortress mentality which Hitler helped to cultivate. But none of these entirely explain the almost obsessive emotional focus which the prospect of Christmas held for those trapped so far from home. Preparations began well before Hoth's panzer divisions advanced north to the Maishkova River and never seemed to have slackened, even when soldiers became excited by the sound of approaching gunfire. From quite early in the month, men started to put aside tiny amounts of food, not in preparation for a breakout across the snow, but for a Christmas feast or for gifts. A unit in 297th Infantry Division slaughtered a pack horse early so as to make horse sausage as Christmas presents. Advent crowns were fashioned from tawny steppe grass instead of evergreen, and little Christmas trees were carved out of wood in desperate attempts to make it just like at home. The sentimentality was by no means restricted to soldiers. General Edler von Daniels decorated his newly dug bunker with a Christmas tree and underneath a cradle with a snapshot of his Kessel baby, born soon after their encirclement. He wrote to his young wife describing his plans to celebrate Christmas Eve in the German way, although in far-off Russia. The military group had clearly become the surrogate family. "Each man sought to bring a little joy to another," he wrote, after visiting his men in their bunkers. It was really uplifting to experience this true comradeship of the front line. One festive banner proclaimed comradeship through blood and iron, which, however appropriate to the circumstances, rather missed the message of Christmas. One person who certainly did not miss the message was Kurt Ruber, the doctor in the 16th Panzer Division. The 36-year-old Ruber, a theologian and friend of Albert Schweitzer, was also a gifted amateur artist. He converted his bunker in the steppe northwest of Stalingrad into a studio and began to draw on the back of a captured Russian map, the only. In positions which were not attacked, men crowded into a bunker which had a wireless to hear the Christmas broadcast of Großdeutscher Rundfunk. To their astonishment, they heard a voice announce, "This is Stalingrad," answered by a choir singing Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, supposedly on the Volga front. Some men accepted the deception as necessary in the circumstances. Others were deeply angered. They felt it was tricking their families and the German people as a whole. Goebbels had already proclaimed that this should be a German Christmas, a definition intended to convey notions of duty and austerity, and perhaps already a way of preparing the nation for news of the tragedy of Stalingrad. At 7 o'clock on Christmas morning, the 6th Army War Diary recorded, "No supply flights arrived in the last 48 hours. a slight exaggeration, supplies and fuel coming to an end. Later that day, Paulus sent a warning signal to Army Group Dawn to be passed back to General Zeitzler. If we do not receive increased rates of supplies in the next few days, we must expect a greatly increased death rate through exhaustion. Although they realized that the snowstorms of the previous day must have hindered flying, they had not been informed that Bogdanov's tanks had stormed onto Tatsinskaya airfield the previous morning. Manstein's headquarters did not even pass on the news that the Soviet counterattack with 4 armies against Hoth's panzer divisions on the Mishkova River had been launched. When 108 tons of supplies finally arrived on Christmas 26th, 6th Army headquarters discovered that they had been sent 10 tons of sweets for Christmas, but no fuel. Most men, when they had the opportunity, sat apart to write a Christmas letter home in which they expressed their longing. "In our hearts, we all keep hoping that everything will change," wrote a doctor with the 44th Infantry Division. He spoke for many, but the better-informed commander-in-chief of the 6th Army was not among them. Christmas, naturally, was not very joyous, Paulus wrote to his wife a few days later. At such moments, festivities are better avoided. One should not, I believe, expect too much from luck. Not surprisingly, the contrast between German and Russian letters home during the Christmas period becomes even more marked than usual. While German letters tended to be sentimental, aching for home and family, the Russian letters that have survived clearly reveal an inexorable logic that the motherland took priority. "Darling," wrote a soldier to his wife on Christmas Eve, "we are pushing the serpents back to where they came from. Our successful advance brings our next meeting closer." "Hello, Maria," wrote a soldier called Kolya. "I've been fighting here for 3 months, defending our beautiful," deleted by censor. "We have started pressing the enemy." On that same morning of 26 December, Paulus sent another signal to Manstein, which began, "Bloody losses, cold, and insufficient supplies have reduced fighting strength of divisions severely." He warned that if the Russians brought back their forces fighting Hoth's Tresians and redeployed them against the 6th Army, it would not be possible to withstand them for long. An unexpected opportunity then arose. General Hube, the commander of 14th Panzer Corps, received an order to fly out of the Kessel on 28 December to Manstein's headquarters at Novocherkassk. An aircraft would take. Daniels appears to have been in a good mood at this time. He had just been promoted to lieutenant general and awarded the Knight's Cross. Then, as a New Year's present from Paulus, he unexpectedly received a bottle of Veuve Clicquot champagne. Several of the Stalingrad generals still seemed to be almost more preoccupied with decorations and promotions than with the fate of the 6th Army. When German midnight arrived, only star shells were fired. High explosive rounds could not be wasted. The very last bottles were opened in the Kessel for the toast. Prosit Neujahr. Soviet divisions, on the other hand, suffered few restrictions on ammunition and alcohol. "Celebrating the New Year was good," wrote Viktor Barsov in the Marine Infantry. "I drank 250 grams of vodka that night. The food wasn't bad. In the morning, to avoid a headache, I drank 200 grams more." German soldiers tried to make light of their misfortunes, with the idea that everything would change for the better with the passing of the old year. "Dear parents, I'm all right. Unfortunately, I again have to go on sentry tonight. I hope that in this new year of 1933, I won't have to survive as many disappointments as in 1942. An almost obsessive optimism was produced by Hitler's New Year message to Paulus and the 6th Army. Only the more skeptical spotted that the text did not constitute a firm guarantee. "In the name of the whole German people, I send you and your valiant army the heartiest good wishes for the new year. The hardness of your perilous position is known to me. Your heroic stand of your troops has my highest respect. You and your soldiers, however, should enter the new year with the unshakable confidence that I and the whole German Wehrmacht will do everything in our power to relieve the defenders of Stalingrad, and that with your staunchness will come the most glorious feat in the history of German arms. Adolf Hitler. Mein Führer, replied Paulus immediately. Your confident words on the new year were greeted here with great enthusiasm. We will justify your trust. You can be certain that we, from the oldest general to the youngest grenadier, will hold out, inspired with a fanatical will, and contribute our share to final victory. Paulus. New Year letters from many soldiers in the Kessel reflected a new mood of determination. We're not letting our spirits sink. Instead, we believe in the word of the Führer. We are maintaining a firm trust in the Führer, unshakable until final victory, wrote an NCO. The Führer knows our worries and needs, wrote a soldier. There were a few days of comparatively mild, wet weather at the very start of the year. Russian soldiers hated the thaw. I don't like the weather in Stalingrad, wrote Barsov in the Marine Infantry. It changes often, and this makes the rifles go rusty. When it becomes warmer, the snow starts to fall. Everything becomes moist. Valenki, felt snow boots, become soaking wet, and we don't get much chance to dry things. He and his comrades were no doubt happier on 5 January when the temperature dropped to -35 degrees. Soviet forces adopted a deliberate tactic to exploit their superiority in winter equipment. The Russians began with probing attacks, wrote a Luftwaffe liaison officer. If they breached the line, none of us were in a position to dig new fire trenches. The men were physically too weak, owing to lack of food, and the ground was frozen rock hard. Stranded on the open steppe, even more would die. On 6 January, Paulus signaled to General Zeitzler, "Army starving and frozen, have no ammunition and cannot move tanks anymore." The same day, Hitler awarded General Schmidt the Knight Cross of the Iron Cross. Now that the fate of the Sixth Army was certain, Soviet journalists were brought to Dawn Front headquarters at Zavatikino. A delegation of Soviet writers came down from the capital to visit the 173rd Rifle Division, which had been raised from the Kievsky district of Moscow and contained many intellectuals. From the command post of 65th Army, writers Alexander Korniachuk and Wanda Vasilevska watched the division attack the Kazachi Kurgan, a Tartar burial mound on the northwest of the Kessel. Even before Hoff's rescue attempt had been crushed on the Mishkova River, Stalin was harrying his generals to produce plans for the annihilation of the Sixth Army. On 19th December, he had telephoned Voronov, the Stavka representative overseeing Operation Little Saturn, and told him to move to Dawn Front headquarters. Voronov installed himself close to Rokossovsky's residence, adjoining villages of Zavatikino and Medvedevo, where the accommodation for each general or department consisted of a 5-walled peasant izba, a log cabin with a dividing wall down the middle. American Willys staff cars, with Soviet markings, lurched in and out of the frozen ruts, taking generals off on tours of inspection. Rokossovsky, the commander-in-chief responsible for the coup de grace on the Sixth Army, was allowed 47 divisions, 5,610 field guns and heavy mortars, and 169 tanks. This force of 218,000 men was supported by 300 aircraft. But Stalin's impatience again built up, just as he was planning a strike against the Hungarian Second Army. To his fury, he was told that transport difficulties had slowed the delivery of reinforcements, supplies, and ammunition. Voronov demanded yet another delay of 4 days. Stalin's sarcasm was bitter. "You'll be sitting around there until the Germans take you and Rokossovsky prisoners." With great reluctance, he agreed to the new date of 10 January. German officers outside the Kessel had been wondering what would happen next. General Fiebig, the the commander of 8th Air Corps, wondered after a long conversation with Richthofen, why don't the Russians crush the Kessel like a ripe fruit? Red Army officers on the Don front were also surprised about the delay and wondered how long it would be before they received their orders to attack. Voronov, however, had received another call from Moscow, now telling him that an ultimatum to the Sixth Army must be prepared. Voronov, in that first week of January 1943, wrote a draft addressed personally to Paulus. Constant calls from Moscow with Stalin's amendments were necessary. When finally approved, it was translated at dawn. "We will fulfill it, Comrade Colonel General," they chanted as one. Malinin then ordered the front quartermaster-in-chief to kit out the two officers in the smartest uniforms available. The Germans had to be impressed. The quartermaster promised to have them dressed like bridegrooms and winked like a magician at the two envoys. With Voronov's backing, he had every general's aide at front headquarters on parade in his department. He ordered them all to strip so that Dyadlenko and Smyslov could try on their uniforms and boots. The two envoys soon found themselves in a Willys staff car with Colonel Vinogradov. Their destination, they were told, was Kotlebane Station on 24th Army's sector. Russian troops in the area had received the order to cease firing from dusk. Then, all through the night, Red Army loudspeakers broadcast a message prepared by Ulbricht's anti-fascists, telling the Germans to expect truce envoys. By the next dawn, 8th January, firing had ceased. Smyslov and Dyadlenko were allotted a tall corporal equipped with a white flag and a 3-note trumpet. It was unusually quiet on the snow-covered plain when they advanced to the very front trenches. The corporal blew the trumpet call, "Attention! Attention! Everybody listen!" They advanced for about 100 yards, then firing broke out. The three men were forced to dive for cover behind a low rampart made in the snow by Russian reconnaissance groups for night observation. The bridegroom uniforms soon looked less smart. They also offered little protection from the intense cold. When the firing died away, Smyslov and Dyadlenko rose to their feet and cautiously recommenced. Smyslov and Dyadlenko had slept for a couple of hours at front headquarters when they were woken at around midnight. A staff car was outside waiting for them by the time they had dressed in their old uniforms. The ADCs had immediately reclaimed their property. When they reached the intelligence department, they discovered that Colonel Vinogradov had been promoted to Major General, and they had been awarded the Order of the Red Star. Vinogradov, having joked that he had been promoted for all the trousers he had worn out during his service, added that Smyslov and Dyadlenko would receive an even more important medal if they managed to carry out their mission at a second attempt. The two envoys were told to climb into a staff car with Vinogradov and the officer appointed to replace him as chief of intelligence. As they drove through the night again, the two newly promoted generals sang songs and kept interrupting each other with generals' anecdotes. Although Dyadlenko's respectful account does not say that they were drunk, they certainly appear to have been celebrating their promotions. The rhythm of the songs was continually broken as the staff car lurched in and out of huge potholes along the frozen dirt roads. It was a long journey round the southern side of the Kessel, crossing the Don westwards, then back across again at Kalaj to the sector covered by 21st Army. Shortly before dawn, they reached the headquarters of the 96th Rifle Division, a few miles to the west of Marinova. Rather like condemned prisoners, Smyslov and Dyadlenko were given breakfast, boosted by a Narkom's ration. Vinogradov put a stop to a second helping and told them to get ready. Then they suddenly realized that they had handed the white flag back to the quartermaster at front headquarters. A new one had to be made using one of the divisional commander's sheets nailed crudely to a branch from an acacia. The staff car drove them to the front line and parked in a balka, from where the party proceeded forwards on foot. Smyslov and Sidorov were joined by an elderly warrant officer with a trumpet who introduced himself as commander of the musical platoon Sidorov. A lieutenant also stepped forward and offered to escort them through the minefields, because my life is not worth as much as yours," he explained. The three envoys put on camouflage suits just behind the front trenches, then set off across the white expanse, which blurred into a heavy mist. Some 24 humps of snow ahead were frozen bodies. General Vinogradov and the other two generals climbed onto a burnt-out Russian tank to watch proceedings. Sidorov blew the trumpet. The call, "Attention, attention," sounded. The senior lieutenant led Dyatlenko by the hand. After a few steps, he asked, with a smile in his voice, what was written in the message to Paulus. That we should surrender? "I am not ordered to know," Dyatlenko replied, using the formula of the Tsarist army. They changed the subject. "Tell me, please," said the lieutenant, "if it is true that a German writer called Willy Bradel has been in Platonovsky. He has been addressing my soldiers on the radio for 10 or maybe 14 days. He appealed to them to surrender and swore that their lives would be spared. Of course, my soldiers just laughed at him. But was he really here? It was clear from his accent that he was from Hamburg. So was it really him or a record of his voice?" Dyatlenko longed to reply. Bradel was indeed one of the Germans working for his section, and he got on well with him. But if he gave any hint, then the lieutenant would have understood immediately what his real job was. An unplanned diversion occurred at that moment. The ice on which they were walking was both uneven from shellfire, yet also polished by the passage of boots wrapped in rags. Dyatlenko fell, knocking down the lieutenant. Smyslov, hearing the commotion, shouted in alarm. Dyatlenko reassured Smyslov and apologized to the lieutenant. He was not afraid of a trick. "About 1,000 prisoners of war had passed through my hands by then," he wrote afterwards. "I knew their psychology sufficiently well as a result, and I knew that these men would not harm me." German soldiers who came to lift the two fallen men slipped over in their turn, making a sprawling mass of bodies. Dyatlenko compared it to the Ukrainian children's game called "A little heap is too little, someone is needed on top." The lieutenant kept up his questioning when the blindfold march resumed, then returned to the question of Bradel. Dyatlenko was less than frank. He said that the name was known to him, and he had even read some of his books. Finally, the lieutenant warned him that they were coming to some steps. The three truce envoys found themselves, when their blindfolds were removed, in a well-built bunker lined with tree trunks. Tension rose during the long wait for the colonel's return. But when he came, it was not to announce as expected that a staff car had been sent from 6th Army headquarters. He had, in Dyatlenko's words, a very different expression, like a beaten dog. The junior officers, guessing what had happened, rose to their feet, as if a sentence was about to be pronounced on all of them. "I am ordered," the colonel announced to the Russians, "not to take you anywhere, not to accompany you, nor to receive anything from you, only to cover your eyes again, to lead you back, to return your pistols, and guarantee your safety." Dyatlenko protested most volubly. He offered, even though it was against his instructions, to give the oilskin packet to a specially authorized officer in return for a receipt. "I am ordered to take nothing from you," replied the German colonel. "Then we ask you to write on the package that you, in accordance with orders received from higher command, refuse to accept the letter addressed to your army commander." But the colonel refused even to touch the packet. There was nothing left, Smyslov and Dyatlenko concluded, but to allow themselves to be blindfolded again and escorted back. The same senior lieutenant guided Dyatlenko back. "How old are you?" Dyatlenko whispered after they had set off. 24, he replied. There were only a few years between them. "This war between our peoples is a tragic mistake," Dyatlenko said after a short pause. "It will finish sooner or later, and it would be good for me to meet you on that day, wouldn't it?" "There is no room for illusions in my heart," said the German lieutenant, "because before a month is up, both you and I will be dead. Did you Germans